Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video, where today we're going to be discussing the mysterious death of Netta Fornario, a very strange story intertwined with the occult. I do want to say though, before I get into this one, that the majority of information about this case seems to have seeped from blog post to blog post across the internet, and there seems to be very few actual reliable sources I could find. So whilst I've done my best to tell her story as it happened and do her justice, I am aware there seems to be a bit of Chinese whispers in this case. Take it all with a pinch of salt, but this just seemed like the perfect story to talk about for this time of year. As always, all of my sources will be linked in the description box down below if you want to go and do some further reading. Netta Fornario was found dead on the Scottish island of Iona in the Inner Hebrides on the 19th of November 1929, aged around 32 or 33. I say around because we only know that she was born in 1897, not her exact date of birth. She was born Marie Nora Emily Edith Fornario, Netta Fornario for short, in Cairo, Egypt, as a daughter of Manchester-born Nora Edith Ling and Italian doctor Giuseppe Fornario. Her mother died just 1 year later, and with Giuseppe going back to work in Egypt, Netta was placed in the care of her rich maternal grandfather Thomas Ling. They lived in Streatham in London. Only Thomas Ling would go on to die when Netta was just 12 years old, and she was left a decent amount of money in her grandfather's will, under the condition that she shall remain under the guardianship of his son George or other person approved by his trustees. He also said that the income should only be paid to her in the United Kingdom, unless there was a medical reason or some other cause to be approved by his trustees. That means she's not a United Kingdom at that point. So from what I can gather, Netta was not a British citizen. As we know, her father was Italian, she was born in Egypt, she lived in Italy as a young child, as a baby. So this was probably her grandfather trying to keep her in the country in the UK. After this, she was sent to the Ladies' College in Eastbourne for a proper Victorian ladies' education. She would eventually become a naturalised British citizen around July 1922, when she was about 25 years old. It seems that she spent a lot of time in Italy until this point as an Italian citizen, but she only came back to the UK once she was a British citizen. Netta was considered to be a fairly unusual woman for the times, and she surrounded herself with like-minded people. She likely never felt out of place in her own life. London had been recently experiencing a huge rise in the amount of occult societies, and after her return to England from Italy, she got involved with the Alpha A Omega section of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. She also joined the Co-Masonry, and she became friends with a woman called Dion Fortune, who was a fairly well-known British occultist for the time and also an author. Fortune's first magical mentor was a Freemason called Theodore Moriarty, and Dion went to write a book in which he fictionalised Moriarty as the character Dr. Taverner. Weirdly, Dion wrote one story about Dr. Taverner which would spookily mirror the weird circumstances of Netta's death years later. Other than all of this though, we don't know loads about Netta's life before her death. She definitely had a big interest in the occult. As part of being a member of the Alpha Omega, she would have learned about magic, how to summon spirits and demons. She'd take part in occult ceremonies. She was fascinated with fairies and nature spirits. She probably rejected the fashion of the time, and she enjoyed writing as well. Netta wrote many pieces under the name Mac Tyler or sometimes under Marie Fornario, and her pieces were almost always about the occult. She had a particular interest in fairies, as I said, and you can find samples of her writing online. I'll try and leave some link down below if I remember, but it's very interesting. Netta was said to have this dark, wild hair that she often wore in plaits, and she wore clothing inspired by the occult, not at all in keeping with the fashions of the time. And she absolutely never wore a hat, and she wore a lot of silver jewellery. As far as I'm aware, there are no existing photos of Netta, but just for reference, I picture her as having a very Helena Bonham Carter vibe about her. In this time in London, she lived on Mortlake Road in Kew, and a housekeeper at the time allegedly stated that Netta didn't believe in doctors or modern medicine. She was always curing people by telepathy. So Netta was a fairly odd woman, but generally she was cheerful and happy. Apparently at one point she attempted a 40-day fast but was persuaded to give up after just a couple of weeks. She was clearly very passionate with her learning about the occult and spirituality, so it only made sense in the late summer of 1929 Netta would leave London for the tiny Scottish island of Iona. So Iona is an island located in the Inner Hebrides off the coast of the Isle of Mull in Scotland. When I say tiny, I mean tiny. It's only about 1.5 by 3 miles long, with only around 120 permanent residents. But it is a very popular tourist destination, specifically for very spiritual people who flock there for a number of annual spiritual retreats. Iona is well known as being the cradle of Christianity, and about 130,000 tourists visit every single year. That's a lot of people on a very small island. Spiritual people talk about how Iona is a thin place, one of the only places in the world where heaven and earth are separated by only the thinnest of veils. As early as 563 AD, the island was the site of a highly important monastery, founded by a monk and 12 companions who had been exiled from Ireland. This monastery was hugely important in the conversion of the Celtic people to Christianity in these early days. The Iona Abbey became renowned across the country, and it quickly became an important Christian centre of learning. The scriptorium, which is literally just a place for writing, produced some highly important documents over the years. Even the Book of Kells was said to be written here, which is a 9th century manuscript of the New Testament Gospels, regarded as highly important in Ireland in particular. If you're Irish, you've probably heard of it. Slowly over the years, other monasteries opened up across Scotland, and Vikings would regularly raid the very easily accessible Iona, so it lost its power. But the abbey still stands today and is one of the main attractions for tourists. Iona is a place with a long and rich history. For very obvious reasons, it's very important to Christian people, but also just spiritual people in general. It just has something about it that makes people feel closer to the other side, to the spirits. There's also Relig Otrain, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of, I leave it on the screen, based on the island in St Oran's graveyard, which predates even Christianity. And it's the burial place of the early Scottish kings from as early as 558 AD. And it was also the burial place of many clan chiefs. Although incredibly historical, this graveyard is still used today, and many of the early grave markers from the 8th century are still preserved. The earth of Iona is said to be so sacred that it purifies sins. So you can see why people feel very drawn to this island. Some say there's a strange ethereal light which occasionally covers it, the light of the spirits peeking through that incredibly thin veil I spoke of. Whether you make a pilgrimage there for religious reasons, or to search for fairies, or to touch a purifying earth, it's incredibly important to people. I mean, Scotland in general is considered to be incredibly spiritual, but specifically Iona. So it makes sense that Netta, being such a spiritual person herself, would feel like she had to go there. She felt called to it. It's something known in the spiritual circles as the call of the Isles, a strange feeling deep inside your soul that you need to travel to Iona. You're just drawn there. But Netta's journey to Iona may also have been aided by her obsession with the writings of Fiona MacLeod, who had written an article entitled Iona, in which she wrote about living on the island as a child and the communication she had with spirits during this time. One of Fiona's childhood friends, Elsie, is said to have communicated with the spirits of the monks from centuries beforehand. Elsie felt spirits of the monks hanging around everywhere she went, except for one specific spot over at Loch Stonegg. Again, I'm going to put it on the screen. I couldn't find anywhere that said how it's pronounced, which is a freshwater loch at the south end of the island. It was the only place that Elsie could find peace. And people who knew Netta spoke how she was obsessed with this story in particular, obsessed with the story of Fiona and Elsie and the spirits. So it's the late summer / early autumn of 1929 and Netta Fornario steps off the ferry onto the soils of Iona. Some sources say that she wanted to make contact with the island's ancient spirits, and others say that she wanted to perform a magical healing ritual. Some say that she just wanted to visit the setting of her favourite story. She arrived in Iona with a huge amount of luggage, even bringing enough furniture with her to furnish a small house, which suggests that she planned on staying for a while, perhaps even permanently. But she'd organised no place to stay at all. Luckily for her, this time of year most of the summer tourists were leaving and the rooms were abundant. She soon finds lodgings with a Mrs McRae in Traymore, a small village on the island. Mrs McRae and Netta made a very odd pair, but they seemed to have this strange affinity with one another. Mrs McRae loved to talk about the island and share her stories, and Netta seemed more than willing to listen and shared her own stories of the occult, which fascinated Mrs McRae. There was just this mutual fascination between them. For full clarity, some sources call Mrs McRae Mrs Cameron instead. I have no idea which is the right name here, but I'm just going to go with McRae. Mrs McRae would later say how Netta spent most of her days just wandering the island, roaming the beaches and the moorlands. At one point, Netta confided in Mrs McRae that before she was travelling to Iona, she had recently undergone a trance which lasted a full week, and she gave Mrs McRae strict instructions. If she was to fall under such a trance again in her attempts to contact the spirit world, she was not to contact the authorities or any kind of doctor under any circumstances. Mrs McRae was obviously very concerned, but she agreed nonetheless, just thinking it was one of her quirky ways. But this concern only intensified when by mid-November she noticed that Netta's behaviour was even more unusual than usual. As the weeks went on, Mrs McRae got more and more concerned. Netta would do strange things like disappear for entire nights. One morning, Sunday the 16th of November, Netta woke up apparently seeming frantic, agitated and panicked. She told Mrs McRae that she needed to leave the island immediately. She was muttering away to herself about how people were talking to her telepathically. She couldn't seem to focus on anything else. And somehow the silver jewellery she always wore had turned black, seemingly overnight. Netta spoke of a rudderless boat she saw flying across the sky. Something very strange was happening, and she began packing up her stuff in an attempt to return back to London. But unluckily for Netta, the ferries to the mainland didn't run on Sundays. She was going to have to wait until the next morning. So she simply returned to her room to rest, and after a while emerged with a calm look of resignation on her face. She seemed a lot better and told Mrs McRae that she had now decided she was going to stay on Iona. It later transpired that just a few days before this, Netta had sent a letter to a housekeeper, Mrs Varney, back in London, stating, "Do not be surprised if you do not hear from me for a long time. I have a terrible case of healing on." The very next morning, when Mrs McRae went to check in on Netta in her room, she was gone, although her belongings did remain, so Mrs McRae didn't think that Netta had followed through on her plans to go back to London. Maybe she'd just left early for one of her walks around the island. But when she failed to return after a few hours, people started to get concerned and a full-scale search began. Perhaps if Netta hadn't been acting so strangely for the 24 hours previously, there wouldn't have been such a quick panic here, but things were definitely strange with her, so people immediately started looking. The locals scoured the island for any sign of Netta. The men searched through the night, and the women and children would join again once day broke. It was the early hours of the morning of the 19th, 2 days after she disappeared, when two locals called Hector McLean and Hector McNiven discovered her. Or should I say, discovered her body. Netta's body was found the opposite end of the island to which she'd been staying, about 2.5 miles away. It was written that she apparently lay between the Macar and Lake Stonig, in a hollow in the chilly moor. She was quite dead, and except for a silver chain turned black, quite naked. One hand clutched a knife, the other lay between her head and the cold moor. She had died of exhaustion and exposure. From what I can gather and from what Mrs McRae had said, her necklace was already black before this point, and apparently when Netta was asked about her black jewellery, she replied, "This always happens to her when she wore it." Netta was found next to a fairy mound, a hill that is essentially the remnant of an Iron Age Celtic structure that has been covered by nature over time. She was found naked except for a thin black veil, and a cross had been found carved into the hillside close to where she was found, something which some occultists say is a method used when contacting the fairy realm. Which makes sense considering she was found next to a fairy mound and she was incredibly spiritual. Was this what Netta was trying to do? I have no idea the size or the dimensions of this cross. It could have been this big, it could have been as big as her entire body. A 1929 article from the Scotsman reads, "Her unclothed body was lying on a large cross which had been cut out of the turf." But then again, some other sources say that the cross was away from her body, so we don't know. I'm picturing a fairly chunky sized cross, but who knows? And we also can't brush over the fact that she was found very close to Loch Stonig, the very same loch in the Fiona McLeod story that may have been the reason that she travelled to Iona in the first place. A weird coincidence or not? Netta's death certificate remained rather vague, as the doctor who examined her body struggled to narrow down a time of death, just pronouncing that she died at any point from 10 PM on the 17th and 1:30 PM on the 19th. I guess it was November and it likely would have been very cold on this Scottish island, so I'm sure her body would have been very well preserved if she had been dead for 2 days. Her cause of death was noted as exposure to the elements or heart failure from exposure. Such a small island as Iona wouldn't have had highly trained pathologists or medical examiners, so I doubt her death was looked into all that much. She probably didn't have a full-on autopsy examining each and every organ. They just didn't really know what had caused her death, but the fact that she was outside, essentially naked, for 2 days in November made exposure to the element a decent enough guess. Some reports speak of scratches found on her toes and a few on her body, which she may have got by potentially walking barefoot for 2.5 miles. But some other sources say that there were deep scratches, her toes literally torn apart, as if something had scratched her. Because of her cause of death being ruled as exposure and no obvious signs of foul play, there was never any police investigation into her death, despite the fact that they apparently took a number of strange letters written by Netta into custody. Nobody's sure exactly what these letters consisted of though. To this day we don't know. She died with a sum of £424, 18 shillings and 6 pence in her estate, about £25,000 in today's money, which is enough to consider somebody pretty well off back then. Netta was eventually buried at her family's request in a very simple grave on the island, etched with her initials MEF for Marie Emily Fornario, and rumours of her strange death began to circulate. Rumours of strange blue lights being seen near the body and a man dressed in a long dark cloak lurking around. Her friend Dion Fortune said, "I knew Miss Fornario intimately. She was half English and half Italian and was especially interested in green ray elemental contacts. Too much interested in them for my peace of mind, and I became nervous and refused to contact her. It appeared to me that Mac, as we called her, was going into very deep waters, even when I knew her, and there was certain to be trouble sooner or later. She had evidently been on an astral expedition from which she never returned, but she was not a good subject for such expeditions, for she suffered from a defect of the pituitary body." So this is Dion Fortune, a huge name in the occult at the time, and it seems from this quote that even she thinks that Netta was going too far, that she didn't have the disposition per se to contact the spirits that she was trying to contact. And in terms of theories, I don't want to speculate too much on something I don't entirely understand, but I'm sure some of my viewers may be interested or even a part of the occult and might be able to leave some comments about your thoughts and feelings on the situation surrounding Netta's death down below. Could it be possible that she was indeed having people or spirits talk to her telepathically? Did she head to this specific fairy round to do some kind of ritual to contact the spirits or to get them to stop? Or did she head to the loch in an attempt to find peace, as Elsie had done in Fiona McLeod's story? Did the voices just get too much? Remember, she told Mr. McRae that she had voices talking to her telepathically. Perhaps being a spiritual person in general, Netta found being on Iona, where the veil between the two worlds is said to be so thin, completely overwhelming. Maybe it made her lose her mind in a way that she never expected. Is it possible that the spirits could have physically harmed her? That's me genuinely asking viewers to help me out on that one. This isn't my area of expertise at all, and I don't want to speculate in case it's all completely wrong or I offend anyone. I am self-admittedly incredibly atheist. I'm not at all spiritual, I'm very fact-based. I only believe things that be 100% proven with fact. I struggle to believe in spirits and the supernatural, and that's not me dismissing it at all. I wish I could be more spiritual, but it's just not who I am. But I do find stories like this one really fascinating, and I would be intrigued to hear the thoughts of more spiritual people down below. This journey that Netta went on through her life with the occult and her experience in Iona is just not something that I can really fathom or understand, and it's so interesting to me how every single person on this earth is just living an entirely different experience. Netta's world is so far removed from my own. But if I were to share my own thoughts on this case, I would say that Netta had some sort of mental illness or perhaps a mental breakdown. She couldn't cope, so in her belief she goes to the loch in an attempt to find peace and succumb to the elements. I think she likely died not long after she left her lodgings at Mrs. McRae's. She was clearly already in a bad way by that point. Mrs. McRae said that Netta's eyes seemed very vacant the last time they spoke. It wouldn't have taken long for her to walk the 2.5 miles to where she was found if she'd walked straight there. Once she arrived, did she just sit and wait? Did she do a ritual? Did she perhaps lie down to take a nap and just died? It was cold. But then the biggest question for me is the black jewellery. Why would her jewellery turn black every single time she wore it? Could that be something magical? There does seem to be a possible medical explanation though in the form of acidosis, which I am absolutely not claiming to be my own theory. I saw this on cyphermysteries.com, again it'll be linked down below with my sources. Acidosis is something that's quite common in type 1 diabetes, diabetic ketoacidosis. It is a serious complication and happens when your blood sugar is incredibly high. Apparently this acidosis can cause silver to discolour over time, something to do with the pH balance of your body. But this could also be an explanation as to Netta's death. Diabetes. Even Dion Fortune said that Netta suffered from a defect of the pituitary body. But Netta wasn't the type of person to really seek medical help in her life. She didn't believe in doctors, she tried to cure others telepathically, so it's very likely she may have had undiagnosed diabetes. Perhaps the intention of this whole trip was to heal herself. According to the NHS website, 2 of the symptoms of ketoacidosis are feeling very tired or sleepy and confusion. The voices in her head may well have just been in her state of confusion, the insulin in her body just running out. She probably had no idea what was happening to her, and her panic made her want to leave as soon as possible. I think it's highly likely that had Netta stayed in her lodgings, she likely still would have been found dead, but just by mist and grey in her bed. But of course this is all speculation and we can't know any of it for sure. Maybe it wasn't diabetes at all, and maybe it was just exposure. Freezing temperatures and high winds are hard for anyone to withstand for a couple of days in a row. Or maybe it was the spirits. Or maybe it was somebody else entirely who killed her. Maybe somebody was following her and it made her paranoid. Maybe they killed her and placed her body out by the lock and carved the cross as to beg for forgiveness. My only problem with that theory though is that she had no outward signs that she was murdered, no bruising or stab wounds. She only had scratches on her feet and a few on her body, so there's nothing really to point towards the fact that she was murdered. Me being me, I do tend to lean towards the more medical explanations in this case, whether that's diabetes or mental illness, although I suppose even with mental illness, that doesn't explain how she died. It might explain why she was hearing voices and was so frantic and eager to get out, but it doesn't actually explain her death, although it could explain why she was out in the cold for 2 days straight and then the elements killed her potentially. But I'm just very intrigued to see what people in the comments think about this one. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you know of any other cases that involve the supernatural or the occult, then please let me know. I'll be very intrigued to read some more cases similar to this one. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.